Hello and thanks for joining us for today's video. Before we start, we want to talk about our amazing paid partner, BetterHelp. I get really anxious and regretful when I think about how I've lived many years of my life. I'm often haunted by thoughts that we only have one life to live and how much time I've wasted. I think about all the days I can't relive when I was at the depths of my depression. I really wish I had focused on helping myself so I wouldn't have been so miserable. I think about how many people I've hurt and relationships I've damaged because I wasn't caring for myself. But I've been seeing a therapist for several years now, and it's been a tremendous help. Today I feel happier and more productive. My relationships are much better, and I made genuine amends with people I've hurt in the past. It really makes me wish I had started talking to my therapist years ago. If you think therapy can help you, then you should check out BetterHelp, a paid partner. You deserve to be happy and live your best life. I know it's tough to get started with therapy. It took years for me to seek out help, but it's easy to get started with BetterHelp. Just fill out a questionnaire, and in as little as 48 hours, they'll match you with a therapist. They have a huge and diverse network of accredited professionals with various backgrounds and specialties. It's an amazing service if you're looking for a specialist, but one isn't available in your area. If you don't feel like the therapist you're matched with is the right fit, you can switch at no cost. I'm not the only one who thinks BetterHelp is amazing. On Trustpilot, based on over 7,000 reviews, they have a 4.5 rating. Start fresh any day of the year with BetterHelp. Click on the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/criminallylisted and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Start feeling better about yourself and help out Criminally Listed in the process by checking out BetterHelp. Thank you, BetterHelp, for being a paid partner of this video. Number 3. Bruce Lindahl. In our video, 3 decades old cold cases solved in 2020, part 2, we cover the case of Pamela Maurer. In early 1974, 16-year-old Pamela lived in Woodbridge, Illinois, with her parents, 2 brothers, and sister. On the night of January 14, 1974, Pamela was at her friend's home. Around 9:45 p.m., she set off alone to walk to McDonald's, which was just a few blocks away. She planned on returning to her friend's home, but she didn't, and she did not go home. Her parents reported her missing about 2 hours after she left for McDonald's. 16-year-old Pamela Maurer's dead body was found the next morning beside a road about 5 miles from where she was last seen. The medical examiner determined she had been raped and strangled to death with a 3-foot rubber hose. The rubber hose was found close to her body. Biological material from the killer was collected and saved. In 2001, a DNA profile was created from the material. The profile was uploaded to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, also known as CODIS. A match was not found. Another 18 years passed. Then in 2019, forensic genealogy was used to trace the identity of the killer. Investigators narrowed in on Bruce Lindahl, who died at age 28 in April 1981. Lindahl's body was buried in a cemetery in Darren, Illinois. In November 2019, his body was exhumed. A DNA sample was taken, and it conclusively proved that Bruce Lindahl had killed her. Bruce Lindahl was born in January 1953 in St. Charles, Illinois. He went to college and got a degree in electromechanics. He worked as an electrician and then got a job at a vocational school in Caneville, Illinois. Lindahl was popular and had many friends. One of his friends was an officer with the Aurora, Illinois Police Department. In October 1979, Lindahl bought his house from the officer. But their friendship ended in June 1980 when Lindahl was arrested. On June 23, 1980, 25-year-old Deborah Collender, who was nude, pounded on the door of one of Lindahl's neighbors. The neighbor opened the door and Collender explained that she had escaped from Lindahl's home. She said that he had kidnapped her from a local mall. He threatened her with a handgun, raped her, and photographed her. Lindahl was charged with aggravated kidnapping, rape, and deviant sexual assault. His trial was going to be held months later in October 1980. He was out on bond until the trial. On October 7, 1980, days before the trial, 25-year-old Deborah Collender disappeared after leaving her place of employment in Aurora, Illinois. When she didn't show up to testify, the charges against Lindahl were dropped. In April 1981, Bruce Lindahl lived with his girlfriend in Napier, Illinois. On April 4th, Lindahl brought home 18-year-old Charles Hubbard. They had met at a bowling alley hours earlier. Lindahl's girlfriend was out of the apartment that evening. When she returned home, she found both 28-year-old Bruce Lindahl and 18-year-old Charles Hubbard dead on the floor. Hubbard had been stabbed 28 times. Lindahl's femoral artery in his leg had been sliced. He bled to death within minutes. Initially, it was believed to have been a double homicide, but ultimately the police concluded that Lindahl had attacked Hubbard with a knife. During the murder, he cut himself. A year after Lindahl's death, on April 28, 1982, 25-year-old Deborah Collender's remains were found in a shallow grave in a farmer's field in Oswego Township, Illinois. She had been missing for about a year and 9 months. The cause of death could not be determined, but was labeled a homicide. Lindahl is the only suspect in the case. In the lead-up to his trial, Lindahl told a friend that if Collender couldn't testify, the case would be dismissed. Then, she went missing, and the charges against him were dropped. In January 2020, when the police announced that Lindahl had killed Pamela Maurer, they said they suspected he had killed other people that had previously never been connected to him. 4 years later, in March 2024, the police announced that they had linked a fourth victim to Bruce Lindahl. 45 years earlier, in March 1979, 19-year-old Kathy Halley lived in North Aurora, Illinois, with her sister and another young woman. She worked at a local shopping center. On the night, March 29, 1979, Halley left the apartment to pick up her sister at the grocery store where she worked. She never made it to the grocery store. She was reported missing that night. Hours after she was reported missing, the police looked through the parking lot of her apartment complex. Her car was not there. But then, a few hours later, Halley's sister found her car parked on the opposite side of the lot from where she normally parked it. The police believe that someone returned it to the parking lot. The police found evidence of foul play in the car. The contents of Halley's purse were strewn about inside the car, but her money had not been stolen. Also, on the rubber mat behind the driver's seat was a large pool of blood. Hundreds of people searched for 19-year-old Catherine Halley. Eventually, the searches were called off. On April 25, 1979, about 3 weeks after she disappeared, Kathy Halley's body was found floating in the Fox River. She was fully clothed. Her body was badly decomposed, and her remains had to be identified using dental records. The cause of death was never made public. In September 2019, Pamela Maurer's case was reopened. When Lindahl was identified as a suspect, the investigators looked for cases similar to Pamela's murder. This led to Kathy Halley's case being reopened. The investigators were hoping to create a DNA profile, but the DNA was too degraded. 2 years later, in 2022, the police found a box of evidence that contained Lindahl's belongings. It was in the police department in Napier, where Lindahl murdered Charles Hubbard and died. Evidence in the box indicated that Lindahl often went to the shopping center where Kathy Halley worked. This created a new spark in the investigation. The investigators found out that technology was now available to create a DNA profile. In June 2023, Halley's clothes were given to DNA Labs International, which used an MVAC tool. It's described as a DNA wet vacuum. It's valuable when collecting DNA from older cases. In August 2024, the DNA was matched to Bruce Lindahl. It was 9.4 trillion times more likely to have come from Lindahl than anyone else. The police believe that Lindahl kidnapped Hallie in the parking lot of her apartment complex. He drove her in her car to the river, where he raped and murdered her. He then dumped her body and returned her car to the parking lot. The police said that if Lindahl was alive, they would have charged him with murder. 9-year-old Catherine Hallie is Lindahl's second known victim. She was murdered about 3 years after Pamela Maurer was killed. At the time of Hallie's murder, Lindahl was 26 years old. Just over a year after Hallie was killed, in June 1980, 25-year-old Deborah Collender was killed. Then about 10 months after that, Lindahl accidentally killed himself while stabbing 18-year-old Charles Hubbard to death. There are several other murders where Lindahl is a suspect. In the summer of 1971, Bruce Lindahl was 18 years old. Mary Conder was a 29-year-old wife and mother living in a rural area outside Naperville, Illinois. On the morning of September 17, 1971, Conder was at home with her 2-year-old son. Her husband was at work and her daughter was at school. One of her friends stopped by and found the back door open. Mary Conder's dead body was found on the kitchen floor. She had been sexually assaulted and then stabbed 10 times in the chest and abdomen and once in the back. Her son was unharmed. 2 years later, in May 1974, Bruce Lindahl was 21. On May 13, 1974, 18-year-old Karen Sue Schuchard was dropped off at an intersection near a shopping center in Glen Ellen, Illinois. Schuchard was planning on doing some shopping, then going to work at her part-time job. She did not make it to work. She was reported missing that evening. Less than 2 weeks later, Schuchard's body was found floating in the Fox River about 23 miles from where she was last seen. The cause of death was suffocation. The Fox River is where Kathy Hallie's body was found. The bodies were found about 7 miles apart. 6 months after Kathy Hallie was killed, on November 5, 1979, 16-year-old Deborah McCall left her school in Downers Grove, Illinois. She was never seen again. Deborah attended the same high school as Pamela Maurer and Bruce Lindahl. However, none of them attended school at the same time. After Lindahl's death, a couple bought his home and renovated it. Behind walls, in the rafters, and under floorboards, they found photos that Lindahl had taken of women. Some of them looked like willing models, and others did not. The couple threw out the photos without knowing they were connected to a serial killer. The police managed to retrieve some of the photos. Deborah McCall was one of the young women in the photos. Deborah McCall's remains have never been found. Her case remains officially unsolved. Lindahl is the only suspect in the case. The police believe that Bruce Lindahl killed at least 12 people and committed 9 rapes. If he is connected to other murders, we'll have an update in another video. Number 2. The I-65 Killer. In June 2016, we released the video 5 Haunting Unsolved Hotel Mysteries. In the video, we talk about the case of the I-65 Killer. The killer first struck on February 21, 1987. That night, 42-year-old Vicki Heath was working at the front desk of the Super 8 Motel in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. The hotel was just off Interstate 65. Heath was a single mother of a son and a daughter. She had recently gotten engaged. A guest entered the lobby around 6:30 a.m. and found no one there. There were signs that something violent happened in the lobby. For example, the phone had been yanked out of the wall. Shortly after the police arrived, Vicki Heath's dead body was found in a grassy area behind the motel. The 42-year-old mother of 2 had been raped and shot twice in the head. Some money had been stolen from the lobby. No arrests were made in the case, and it went cold. 2 years later, on March 3, 1989, 24-year-old Margaret Mary Gill, who went by Peggy, was working as the night clerk at the Days Inn in Merrillville, Indiana. The hotel was on I-65. Around 5 a.m., the hotel's manager called the front desk several times, but there was no answer. So he called the police. The police arrived and discovered the hotel had been robbed. $179 was missing for the cash register. Peggy Gill, a mother of two, was found dead in a deserted hallway of the hotel. She had been raped and shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber handgun. The police surmised that she was killed shortly after 2 a.m. after the last guest was checked in. Around the same time that Peggy Gill's manager reported her missing, a similar set of events was playing out 50 miles south on I-65 at the Days Inn in Remington, Indiana. At 5 a.m., the police were called because the hotel's office was locked and no one was around. 34-year-old Jeannie Gilbert was working as the night clerk that night. She wasn't scheduled to work, but she changed shifts so she could watch her daughter as she was cheerleading. At 4:30 a.m., Gilbert did a wake-up call. Then after that, she disappeared. The police got into the lobby and found the cash register open. $247 was missing. The hotel was searched, but Gilbert was not found. A short time later, a motorist found her dead body in a farmer's field about 15 miles from the hotel. Gilbert was shot in the left breast, behind the left ear, and the right shoulder with a .22 caliber handgun. Ballistic testing confirmed that the same gun was used in both murders. DNA testing was done, and it confirmed that the same man raped and killed both women. The police determined that Gill was killed first, then the killer drove 50 miles south, and 4 hours after murdering Gill, he killed Gilbert. At the time, the police did not connect Peggy Gill and Jeannie Gilbert's murders to the murder of Vicky Heath. They were murdered hundreds of miles apart in different states. But the similarities between all three were striking. All three were night clerks working at a hotel close to Interstate 65. They were all raped and shot to death. No arrests were made in the murders of Peggy Gill and Jeannie Gilbert. Less than a year later, in January 1990, a 21-year-old woman working as a desk clerk at a Days Inn in Columbus, Indiana, called 911. The hotel was just off I-65. The woman had been raped and stabbed. She ultimately survived the brutal assault. The police immediately suspected it was the work of the killer they called the Days Inn Killer. Like Peggy Gill and Jeannie Gilbert, the woman was working alone at a Days Inn hotel near I-65. A major difference between the crimes was that the woman in Columbus was stabbed and Gill and Gilbert were both shot to death. The woman who survived the assault described the attacker to an FBI sketch artist in March 1991. She said he was a white man in his mid-30s to 40s with salt and pepper hair. His most distinctive feature was his eyes. They were green and cat-like. His right eye veered to the right. The sketch was made public. However, it did not lead to any arrests. In 2008, a DNA profile was created from the evidence in Vicky Heath's murder. Then in 2010, the police announced that the DNA was a match to the murders of Peggy Gill and Jeannie Gilbert. Over the years, the police had connected the killer with 5 other rapes and robberies in different states near I-65. The details of only one of those assaults were made public. In early 1991, a hotel clerk in Rochester, Minnesota, was raped and stabbed. She survived the assault. It was the only crime that wasn't close to Interstate 65. Even though the police had the killer's DNA, the cases continued to go unsolved. The investigators believe that the killer was a seasonal worker because all the attacks happened in the first quarter of the year. They also thought he might have been a traveling salesman, but for decades the cases went unsolved. Then we come to April 2022. The police announced that thanks to genetic genealogy, they had identified the killer. He was Harry Edward Greenwell. Greenwell was born in December 1944 in Louisville, Kentucky. It's believed he was arrested for the first time in January 1963 when he was 18. He had committed an armed robbery. He was sentenced to 2 years in a reformatory. In February 1965, Greenwell was arrested for sodomy. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. He was paroled in October 1969. In April 1978, Greenwell and his 23-year-old wife, Terry Jo, lived in Genoa, Wisconsin. On April 28th, there was a fire in their home and Terry Jo was killed. If there were suspicions that the fire was intentionally started, that has never been made public. It was labeled a kitchen fire. Greenwell remarried in August 1980. He adopted the woman's daughter and fathered a son with her. In June 1982, Greenwell was arrested for stealing 40 batteries from an agriculture store. He couldn't make bond, so he was held in jail until his trial. He escaped twice and was recaptured both times. In August 1982, Greenwell was sentenced to 2 years for the burglary and escape charges. He served 7 months and was paroled. In March 1983, Greenwell was arrested for receiving stolen property. In December 1983, he was released from prison. Greenwell got a job with the Canadian Pacific Railroad. He worked for them for 30 years. As part of his job, he traveled around the American Midwest. In July 1986, his wife filed for divorce. Half a year later, in February 1976, Vicki Heath was raped and murdered. Then March 1989, 2 years after Heath was killed, Peggy Gill and Jeannie Gilbert were murdered. 6 days after Gill and Gilbert were killed, Greenwell was arrested in La Crosse, Wisconsin. It was for a traffic violation. Weeks later, he was arrested for a domestic dispute. There was a restraining order against him, and he had violated it several times. So in April 1989, Greenwell was given 15 months of probation for criminal trespass. In January 1990, he sexually assaulted and stabbed a Days Inn clerk in Indiana. The following year, he attacked a hotel clerk in Rochester, Minnesota. After that, he had several minor brushes with the law. Then, on January 31, 2013, Harry Greenwell died at the age of 68 from cancer. When genetic genealogy led the investigators to Greenwell, they got a DNA sample from one of his close relatives. The probability that it was Greenwell's DNA at the crime scenes was 99.999%. Since Harry Greenwell was dead, he could not be charged with the murders. But the police consider the case of the I-65 killer closed. Number 1. The Long Island Serial Killer. In our September 2017 video, 3 Unsolved Mysteries with Mysterious Phone Calls Part 4, we cover the case of the Long Island Serial Killer. At 4:51 a.m. on May 1, 2010, 23-year-old Shannon Gilbert called 911. Gilbert was a sex worker, and she was at a client's home in Oak Beach, Long Island, New York. She told the 911 dispatcher that someone was after her. In the background, her client and the man who worked as her security are heard trying to calm her down. Gilbert left the client's home alone and continued to tell the 911 dispatcher that someone was after her. The dispatcher repeatedly asked her for her location, but Gilbert did not say where she was. She went to another home in the neighborhood and banged on the door. The neighbor, a 75-year-old man, opened the door. She begged him for help, but didn't want him to call 911. She then ran from his home. The man ended up calling 911. Police arrived in the area about 45 minutes later. They found Gilbert's footprints heading into Gilgo Beach. Gilgo Beach is a 5-mile stretch of a remote beach on the south side of Long Island. It runs along Ocean Parkway, a 15.59-mile-long road. The police were unable to find any other trace of Gilbert. 7 months went by and Shannon Gilbert remained missing. On December 11, 2010, a police officer brought a dog to Gilgo Beach for cadaver search training. He chose Gilgo Beach for the training because Gilbert had gone missing there. The dog found some human remains. Then 2 days later, the bodies of 3 more women were found. All the women were bound with belts or tape, and their bodies were wrapped in burlap. None of the women were Shannon Gilbert. The first set of remains that were found was 27-year-old Amber Lynn Costello, who lived on Long Island. She was last seen alive months earlier on September 2, 2010. She was addicted to heroin and she was also doing sex work. She was last seen leaving her home to meet a client. Another body was 25-year-old Maureen Brainard Barnes. She lived in Norwich, Connecticut. She was a single mother. In the summer of 2007, she was doing sex work. She traveled to Manhattan, New York on July 6, 2007. The last time anyone spoke to her was on July 9, 2007. She was reported missing on July 14, 2007. Another body was 24-year-old Melissa Bartholomew, who went missing on July 12, 2009. She lived in the Bronx, New York. 5 days after Bartholomew vanished, her 15-year-old sister received the first of 5 phone calls from her cell phone. In the first call, the male caller, assumed to be the killer, called Bartholomew a whore. In another call, he explained in graphic detail what he had done to her sexually. In the final call, made on August 26, 2009, nearly 2 months after Bartholomew went missing, the caller said he had killed her and her body was rotting. The fourth body was 22-year-old Megan Waterman from Scarborough, Maine. On July 6, 2010, she was staying at a hotel in Long Island for sex work. The police never released an official cause of death for the 4 women other than saying they were all victims of homicidal violence. However, several sources say that the women were strangled or suffocated. On December 14th, the police announced that they believed that one serial killer was responsible for the murders. He became known as the Long Island Serial Killer, or by the acronym LISK. He was also called the Gilgo Beach Serial Killer. The 4 victims became known as the Gilgo Beach 4. The police continued to search the area. Nearly 4 months later, on March 29, 2011, a skull along with the bones from the hands and forearm of a woman were found about half a mile away from the other remains. The remains were identified as 20-year-old Jessica Taylor, who had been doing sex work when she disappeared. She was last seen alive 8 years earlier on July 21, 2003. She was working in Manhattan. Days after she was last seen, on July 26, 2003, some of her body parts were found in a wooded area in Manorville, New York. Manorville is about 50 miles from Gilgo Beach. On April 4, 2011, days after Taylor's partial remains were found, the remains of 3 more people were found near Gilgo Beach. One was a skull and bones from the hands and right foot of a woman. 9 years later, in 2020, thanks to DNA testing, she was identified as 24-year-old Valerie Mack. Mack had done sex work in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Atlantic City, New Jersey. She went missing sometime in the summer or autumn of 2000. Other parts of Mack's body, including her torso, were found in garbage bags 11 years earlier on November 19, 2000, in a wooded area in Manorville. Mac's body parts were dumped in a different wooded area than Taylor's remains. The torso was bound in rope. The second set of remains found near Gilgo Beach on April 4th were of a biological man of Asian descent. His remains were dressed in women's clothes. The police have surmised that he was a transgender sex worker. He had been beaten to death. The pathologist believed he had been dead for at least 5 years, putting his death at around 2006. He has never been identified. He is described as being between 17 and 23 years old, 5'7" to 5'9", and most likely a descendant of southern China. He has been called Asian Doe. The third set of remains found on April 4th was of a female toddler. The remains were wrapped in a blanket, and she was possibly between the ages of 18 and 24 months. There were no signs of violence on her remains. She has never been identified. It's believed that she was the daughter of Valerie Mack, whose body was found about 250 yards from her remains. At the time, Mack's remains were unidentified, so they were unable to confirm if she had a toddler-aged daughter when she went missing. A week after the 3 sets of remains were discovered, the remains of 2 other people were found. One was the skull of a woman. DNA testing connected the skull to a pair of legs found 15 years earlier, in April 1996, about 60 miles away on Fire Island, New York. In October 2022, the FBI identified her by using genetic genealogy. She was 34-year-old Karen Vergata. She went missing sometime after April 14, 1996. Close to Vergata's skull, the police also found the skull and bones from the arms and legs of another woman in a garbage bag. The police were unable to identify her. Clues to her identity emerged 5 years later in 2016 after some DNA testing. Her torso had been found in a Rubbermaid container in Hempstead Lake State Park in Lakeview, New York, 14 years earlier in June 1997. The park is about 20 miles from Gilgo Beach, but her identity remained a mystery. The woman became known as Peaches because she had a tattoo of a peach in the shape of her heart on her left breast. What the DNA testing showed was that Peaches was the mother of Baby Doe. Within 4 months, the remains of 10 people, 8 women, 1 man, and 1 female toddler, were found on a 50-mile stretch of beach along OSHA Parkway. One major mystery that remained unsolved was the whereabouts of Shannon Gilbert. Her disappearance led to the discovery of the other bodies. Gilbert's body was found in December 2011, 9 months after the last of the 10 bodies were found. Her body was in a tidal marsh in the area. It had been 19 months since she went missing. In a bizarre twist, even though Gilbert's disappearance led to the discovery of a serial killer's dumping ground, the police do not think she was a victim of the serial killer. The pathologist believes she had drowned. Her death was labeled death by misadventure and not homicide. The police have theorized that she was high on drugs and became paranoid. Then she accidentally drowned while trying to escape the people she believed were after her. The police also noted that the evidence strongly suggests that all the other victims were killed elsewhere and then dumped in and around Gilgo Beach. So Gilbert's death did not seem to fit the pattern of the murders. Gilbert's family disagrees with the police's assessment and they believe she was murdered. An independent autopsy was performed. The medical examiner said there was evidence Gilbert was strangled to death, like her hyoid bone was broken. This is common in strangulation deaths. However, the investigators maintained that Shannon Gilbert was not the victim of the Long Island serial killer. Instead, they believe he killed 10 people whose remains were dumped at or near Gilgo Beach. The victims were all killed between April 1996 and September 2010. In December 2010, the first set of remains were found. It's believed that most of them were strangled or suffocated. An exception is Asian Doe, who was beaten to death. All the victims who were dismembered were cut with an electric handsaw. The police had a few suspects, but no arrests were made in the case. For years, the case of the Long Island serial killer remained cold. There was a lot of media coverage on the case. Both Dateline NBC and 48 Hours did stories on the case. There was also a best-selling book, Lost Girls by Robert Kolker, and a 2020 Netflix movie based on the book. But still, the case remained cold. In January 2022, a new task force was organized to investigate the case. They started by looking at every piece of evidence in the case and reviewing all the witness statements. One of the statements was from Amber Costello's boyfriend. Costello and her boyfriend wanted to rip off one of her clients. The client came over to their home the day before she went missing. Costello was alone at the time. Then, before she and the client had sex, her boyfriend came home. He pretended to be upset and kicked the client out of their home, but they kept his money. The boyfriend described the client as a large white man in his mid-40s. He estimated that he was between 6'4" and 6'6". The boyfriend described him as an ogre. He also had brown, bushy hair. Another witness said that when the client was there, he saw a green first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche parked outside Costello's home. Hours after Costello and her boyfriend ripped off the client, at 1:18 a.m., on the last day Costello was seen alive, her phone got a text message from the client's phone. He was using a prepaid phone, which is often called a burner phone. The text reads, quote, "That was not so nice. Do I get credit for the next time?" unquote. The phone that sent the message was in Massapequa Park, New York. Massapequa Park is a village on the south side of Long Island. The village center is about a 15.5-mile drive from Gilgo Beach. The same man contacted Costello several times throughout the day. Then the phone was near Costello's home when she was seen alive for the last time. Costello left her cell phone at home when she went to meet the client. So the police believed they had a description of the killer at his vehicle, and they believed he was somehow connected to Massapequa Park. They looked at records to see if anyone living close or around Massapequa Park owned a green first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche in September 2010 when Costello was killed. They discovered that one man did, 58-year-old Rex Heuermann, who had lived in Massapequa Park his entire life. Heuermann also matched Costello's boyfriend's description of the client. Heuermann is a large white man with dark, bushy hair. Costello's boyfriend estimated that the man was in his mid-40s. In 2010, Heuermann was 47 years old. So the police began to investigate Rex Heuermann. For over 30 years, Heuermann worked in Midtown Manhattan, where several of the victims were last seen. He was an architect and worked at the firm he founded. He had no major brushes with the law. He owed over $425,000 in taxes dating back to 2005. Also, between 2014 and 2022, he sued 4 people he accused of hitting him with their cars. In some cases, he was hit while he was driving, and other times he was walking. Each time he claimed he was seriously injured. In one case in January 2017, he was hit by a car while he was walking. Heuermann sued the driver for $5 million. The driver claimed that he was driving slowly when Heuermann walked with his head down in front of his car. Heuermann agreed to an out-of-court settlement of $55,000. Heuermann had been married for over 25 years. He had a daughter and a stepson. The police were never called to their home. The police also learned that when 3 of the Gilgo Beach 4, Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello were killed, Heuermann's wife was out of the state. The Go-Go Four, whose bodies were found first, were all contacted via burner phones. All the texts they received were sent from phones in Midtown Manhattan, where Heuermann worked, and Massapequa Park, where Heuermann lived. Also, several of the women's phones were traced to Massapequa Park. Megan Waterman's phone was last used close to Heuermann's home. After the women disappeared, some of their phones were used. When the harassing phone calls were made to Melissa Barthelme's family from her phone was in Midtown Manhattan. The police got Heuermann's cellular billing records and credit card bills. The billing records showed where his personal cell phone was physically located when he made texts and calls. These records showed that he was in the same area as the burner phones when they were used to contact the victims. What was most convincing was that there wasn't a time when Heuermann was in a different area when the burner phones were used. There were also email accounts used on the burner phones. One was a Google account. The account was logged onto Google when he did Google searches for things like sex workers and child and sadistic pornography. There were also searches for the Gilgo Beach victims and updates on the case. An AOL account was also used on the burner phones. The police got a search warrant, and in the AOL account, they found pictures used to solicit people for sexual activity. There were selfies of Rex Heuermann. The police learned that on May 19, 2023, more minutes were added to the burner phone at a store in Midtown Manhattan. The police got the CCTV footage from the store. The cameras recorded Heuermann buying the minutes. So the police knew they were on the right track with Heuermann, but they didn't have any physical evidence. Strands of hair were found on 3 of the bodies. They knew it wasn't the killer's hair because it belonged to a female. The police collected beer bottles left with the garbage outside the Heuermann's home. DNA testing was done on 2 of the hairs and the bottles. With one hair, 99.98% of the North American population could be excluded, and 99.69% could be excluded as the source of the second strand of hair. They were able to get Heuermann's wife's DNA from the beer bottles. In both cases, Heuermann's wife could not be excluded as the source of the hairs. A man's hair was in the burlap material covering Megan Waterman's remains. In January 2023, detectives were trailing Heuermann. After eating some pizza, he threw a box with some crust into the garbage. The police collected the pizza box with the crust. A DNA profile was created from the pizza crust and compared to the hair in the burlap. 99.96% of the population could be excluded. Heuermann could not be excluded. On July 13, 2023, 59-year-old Rex Heuermann was arrested. He had one of the burner phones on him. He was initially charged with the murders of Costello, Waterman, and Barthelme. Then the police searched his home. They searched his computer and found an unusual Word document he created in 2000 and updated several times over the next 2 years. It was called HK 2002-04. One section had 4 headings: Problems, Supplies, DS, and TRG. Under problems were words like DNA, footprints, and bloodstains. Listed under supplies were items like tarps, rope, and gloves. The police surmised that DS stood for dump site. Finally, they believed that TRG meant target. Written under the heading was, quote, "Small is good," unquote. The police thought that this was noteworthy because all the victims were petite. There were several other topics including pre-prep, prep, and body prep. Quote, "Wash body inside and all cavities," unquote, was under the body prep heading, along with, quote, "Remove ID marks," unquote, such as tattoos, and, quote, "Remove head and hands," unquote. The police called the document a blueprint for murder. The document was created before the murder of Valerie Mack, who was dismembered. 6 months after Heerman was arrested for the 3 murders, he was charged with the murder of Maureen Brainard Barnes. Then, in June 2024, Heerman was charged with 2 more murders. One is the July 2003 murder of 20-year-old Jessica Taylor. Some of her remains were found in a wooded area in Manorville, and other body parts were found near Gilgo Beach. The second murder was one that no one had connected to the Gilgo Beach murders because it happened in 1993, and no remains were found near the beach. On November 20th, 1993, the dead body of 28-year-old Sandra Costella was found in a wooded area in Southampton, New York. She had been raped and strangled to death. DNA testing was done on a strand of hair found on her body, and Heerman could not be excluded as the source of the DNA. This changed the investigators' timeline of the serial murders. They initially believed that the murder started in April 1996, but they now believe they started in the autumn of 1993. When Costello was killed, Rex Heerman was 29 years old. It also encouraged the police to look at other unsolved murders not connected to Gilgo Beach. Then, in December 2024, Heerman was charged with the murder of 24-year-old Valerie Mack. Some of her remains were found in November 2000 in Manorville, then her skull, hands, and right foot were found on Gilgo Beach. Heerman has pleaded not guilty to the 7 murders. He has not been charged with the murders of Karen Vergetta, Asian Doe, Peaches, and Baby Doe. At the time of this recording, Asian Doe, Peaches, and Baby Doe have not been identified. It's unknown if the district attorney is going to charge him with these murders, but he's a suspect in all 4 cases. Rex Heerman is innocent until proven guilty. He is being held in jail until his trial. A trial date has not been set. Thank you so much for watching today's video. We just want to remind you we started a channel membership where half the funds will go to solve a cold case. For more information, click on the video that's on the screen now. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.